cross-bridge cycling. Cross-bridge cycling. What's the meaning of cross-bridge cycling? It is the process of binding and detachment of the head of myosin from the binding sites on actin. We mentioned previously that with the release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum and binding with troponin C, what's going? We have movement of the tropomyosin away from the binding sites on actin. But now, the head of myosin to bind with actin and produce a cross-bridge cycling, we have the following events. When head of myosin bound with ATP is in the state of complete detachment from the binding site of actin. And as we know, the ATPase activity on the head of myosin will hydrolyze the ATP molecule into ADP and inorganic phosphate. And with the release of inorganic phosphate, with the release of the inorganic phosphate, with the release of inorganic phosphate from the head of myosin, what is going? The head of myosin now can go and produce binding with the actin binding site. There is something which is called binding. So binding occurs with the release of the inorganic phosphate. The head of myosin release the inorganic phosphate and bind with the actin binding site. That is the first step. Then, what is the next? The head of myosin is going to release the ATP, is going to release the ADP. And with the release of the ATP, the head of phosphate is going to produce conformational change, which is bending. Which is what? Bending. What's the meaning of bending? Bending means it's going to produce change its shape, produce conformational change. It's going to generate a power stroke, and this is produced by the release of ADP. And what is going on? When the head of myosin produce this bending movement, it's going to move the actin filament. It's going to move the actin filament inward. It's going to move the actin filament toward the center of the sarcomere, toward the center of the sarcomere. And so we have here in this step with the release of phosphate, we have binding. With the release of ATP, we have bending. And then what's going? The cycle is going to be repeated. The head of myosin is going to release one molecule of ATP, and this will produce detachment. This will produce detachment from what? Detachment from the binding sites. Then binding, bending, detachment, and return to the original position. And this cycle is going to produce what? This cycle is going to produce sliding of the actin over the myosin. Is going to produce sliding of the actin filaments, sliding of the actin filament over the myosin filament, as the head of myosin is going to bring the actin onward, producing binding, bending, and this detachment and return to the original position. This is known as the cross-bridge cycling. Complete molecule ATP detached, release of phosphate binding, release of ADP bending, movement of the actin inward, and this will produce shortening of the sarcomere and muscle contraction. Shortening of the sarcomere and muscle contraction.